1.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
I see.
Hey.
Wow, this is. We have to appreciate Justin's hard work in getting us all on here. This is fantastic. How's everybody today?
Doing well.
Well, better now that I can see all your handsome faces.
Good. Well, I'd kind of like to start with introductions. We have an hour with these fine people. I, of course, am a little bit nervous because these are fellow sculptors, and I look up to each and every one of them. So let's start with Bobby.
Uh-oh.
Introduction. I
I'm
sent you
Bobby
the script.
Jackson. I'm a sculptor. Oh, did you?
Yeah,
I seem to have
okay.
misplaced
Go
it.
ahead. Julie and Bob.
Yep, that's right. Julie and Bob.
Enough said.
Okay. Tom.
I'm Tom Mason. I'm a miniature sculptor. I have a YouTube channel where I teach people how to sculpt called the Mini Sculpting Super Show, and I've been sculpting miniatures since 2002.
Well, now,
Thank
see,
you,
he
Tom.
read,
That's how
he
it's
read
done.
the brief right there. Glenn.
He's a professional.
Hello, I'm Glenn Harris. I'm a digital sculptor, and I'm a big fan of everybody else that's in this room with me. I'm very honored to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. I mean, this is really wonderful. It's kind of secondary to being there in person, but this is pretty close, and I'm really glad that we're able to bring you this. Thank you, Michael, for having us on your show.
This is our show. I have to tell you that
Our
every
show.
week, but it's our
Thank
show.
you for having
You're
us
my-
on our show.
you're
That
not-
sounds still
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Why don't you
something like
introduce
that.
yourself?
Hi, my name is Michael Proctor. I'm not in the least bit nervous about anything. I know all these folks, and they're all friends, and so I'm excited to be part of the sculpting panel. I'd like to learn more about sculpting.
I bet
Okay,
you would.
well, we can teach you right here, right now.
Yeah, right here, right now. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay,
Anyways,
go to the store and get some green putty.
I'll be back.
All right.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, let's keep going. Okay, I had a number of questions in mind, but this is going to be as free-flowing as you guys want it to be. We'll try not to talk over each other. But the very first thing, we've kind of gone over individually, in person, different things that we've done over the years. My first question is an influence outside of our industry that influences your sculpting, an art influence. But they can't be within the industry. Bobby, you first.
Wow.
Sorry.
I
I
probably
Okay.
don't have any since nothing comes to mind.
nothing. No, nobody. Okay, great. Julie and Bob.
Best guest ever.
You want to start?
The zoo influences me. Going and seeing
That's what
animals.
I was thinking.
Nature.
Yeah, what she said.
Okay, so Julie says the zoo. And why does the zoo? What is it about the zoo?
Getting to see animals moving around, not just still pictures. That kind of thing.
Bob?
Just any
The
other
answer is
sculptural
Julie, Bob.
stuff.
Although she's
Yeah,
in the
pretty much,
industry.
Do you,
Yeah, she's
do you
in
go to
the
the zoo with Julie?
No, they won't let me in anymore.
That's what I thought. Last time I was there, they tried to lock me up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, Tom, you've had a while to think about this. I apparently surprised Bobby. So, how about an influence on your sculpting from outside the industry?
Yeah, definitely. So, big influence for me are a lot of the cartoons that I watched growing up. Very specifically, there was this little show on Nickelodeon when I was a kid called Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics, and it was a Japanese animation import onto Nickelodeon. Just went through tons of the Grimm's fairy tales and that old, more simple, cartoony style, and just how it brought all the fantasy into my life. That was one of my first early experiences with that anyways, and so that's always been a big influence.
That's a good influence. I've always found that the broad strokes of comic books and animation seem to lend themselves well to trying to tell our stories in such a miniature form.
Mm-hmm.
Glenn, you've had a good
Yeah,
run at it.
well,
Let's see what you come up with.
Well, outside of obviously the miniatures industry, I'm actually a licensed physical therapist assistant, and I was a martial artist for about 9 years. So I find that that helps you think about how do people move, how do joints move, where balance points are, things like that. So a lot of times I think, all right, well, would this pose be comfortable for somebody to get into? Is the head in the correct place so the person is going to fall over? And yeah, surprisingly, that actually is something I refer back to a lot.
That's great. That's a great answer. Much better than Bobby's, by the way.
Yeah.
Michael, how
Bobby's-
about you? Since you haven't had much to say so far.
Oh, what influenced me? Or
Yeah.
do I have a question? I was thinking about that. What was kind of one of the things that got me into the hobby? And I have this old book. You guys remember this book?
I
Oh,
have
that's a
that book
great
too. It's an
Yeah.
amazing book.
So this is an amazing book. And the funny thing about it, and it's I stole this from the library back in the day.
Very good. And who's
I liked it so much.
who's the
I just kept
artist? There's a
checking it out.
primary artist on that book,
Oh yeah,
Michael.
it is Julik, Julek Heller, Heller. And this book, along with a lot of Brahms stuff, a lot of things that just kept me interested, and I mean, just the neat giants. And there's a book with fairies in it as well, and then Dark Crystal and movies and whatnot. That's really what I like, those kind of vibes of the sculpts and stuff like that, and that's what really got me into this whole world. Yeah.
Tremendous.
I had a question for the group, and I'm not going to pick Bobby first because
I want to go with Michael's answer. I have the same answer as Michael.
There you go. Bobby's managed to formulate an answer. How about this time we start with Glenn, though, Michael?
Yeah, I'm going to start with Glenn
Uh-oh.
and get Bobby's brain.
And then
some time to
Bobby can
process
have
the
some time to
question.
think because
And then
he needs to
and then he can
ruminate a
copy-
little bit.
He can copy and steal ideas from other folks. Does that help, Bobby?
That's how I've made a living for over 20 years.
I would like to know, and in your development of the hobby, in your development as a sculptor, who were maybe a couple of folks that were already in the industry and that inspired you to like, I want to start emulating that style, or I want to start copying theirs so I can get better. Does that make sense, Glenn?
Yeah. When I first started sculpting, I actually was still working for Games Workshop in the U.S. studio. I worked in the promotions department.
Oh, wow.
I actually was the guy that put on like Games Day and things like that. And when I wasn't working on events, I was, building things and, painting or sculpting in the back.
So you can
And
hook
one
me
day I
up with
decided
an
I
old.
wanted-
You can hook me up with an old golden demon then, if I just send you my address.
I don't have any. I have some rogue demons if you really want one.
Okay. Sure.
But,
Okay.
yeah,
Whatever. We'll talk later. Go ahead. Sorry.
But I was lucky enough to go over to England a few times, and they knew that I was interested in sculpting, so I got to sit with some of the sculptors over there. So some of the first ones that kind of gave me a nudge in the right direction was like Brian Nelson and Michael Perry and Gary Morley were incredibly giving with their time. And after I was no longer with Games Workshop, I was lucky enough to go to the old Gen Con sculptors meetings that Reaper used to host back in the day, way back when it was in Milwaukee. And that's where I got to meet many of the fine people on this panel here who actually influenced me a lot and kind of pushed me in the right direction. The funny thing was when I was working for Games Workshop, I was actually calling Ron at Reaper asking for advice on learning how to sculpt because it was a volatile atmosphere at Games Workshop in the 90s. And I didn't want to pursue being a sculptor for Games Workshop, but I actually realized that there was a lot of good American sculptors out there and that Reaper was actually a good company. So Ron actually helped me out a lot. Bobby Jackson actually gave Ron permission to send me some of the dollies that he had made, the sculpting dollies before they were commercially available. So I actually had practice on some of those. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Bobby.
Awesome.
Who I actually had contacted him through the old Windless Sculpting group.
Right.
Way back when.
Neat.
Wow.
That's
Great
also
group.
where I knew Jason from, and yeah, right.
Awesome.
That I believe Tom was on there too.
Mm-hmm.
I think in theory I'm still a moderator on there, but I have no idea how to even log in. I just periodically get emails from
somewhere
them.
else now. Yeah.
Well, if somebody's interested in sculpting and they can find that group, there are some great files on there.
That's a fact.
Multiple facts, all sorts of stuff that you could download. I mean, no one's ever made a book out of it, but I'll bet you it would come close to a book on how to sculpt. It would
Yeah,
be,
the
it
kids
would be
these
a
days like to
valuable
watch
resource.
videos, so you probably appeal to old people who like to read.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, so let's jump down to Tom. Tom, same question to you. Like,
Yeah.
who was before you
So-
that inspired you to do what you do?
My path was a little similar to Glenn's, but I always looked up to all the sculptors of Reaper, the people here and the people on the next panel as well. It was a really great treat to go to the sculptors meet. The first one I went to was when Gen Con first went to Indianapolis. And when I got to sit down next to Gene and Bobby, I was like, whoa, freaking out. And I had my other friend there who was just obsessed with Bobby's sculpts. And he couldn't believe that we just got to be in the same room with all these great sculptors. But as far as other sculptors without that or beyond that, people like Bob Naismith, a lot of the older Games Workshop sculptors that were just pumping out Space Marines and orcs and dwarves and just everything under the sun back then. That's what got me into miniatures, and those were the kind of miniatures I originally wanted to sculpt when I first decided to pick up the tools and find some putty.
Awesome. Well, we're still going to let Bobby stew on this question, but I wanted to throw this question to both Bob and Julie together. You guys have been in the industry for a long time.
Were there
Right.
sculptors
I was going to say,
before
I don't
us?
think there were many
We're
sculptors.
not gonna, I'm really sensitive for you about that issue. But anyways, yeah.
You'll have to say that a little louder, Michael.
There were people working in furnace solder.
Yeah. But anyways, I mean, what's your guys' feedback on that?
I can start because
Yeah.
my first foray into the miniatures world was because of Julie's sculpts. I had a whole different life and a different career before I noticed miniatures, and I thought her stuff was great. At the time, I didn't even know it was a woman because it just said J. Guthrie on most of it. And when I
Right.
first decided I wanted to at least try it, I sent a piece to Ralph Partha. It was horrible. They cast it, and they put me in contact with the art director, and it was Julie, and she still has a copy of that first figure I ever did. So I have to be very careful what I say from here on out.
Mm.
But there really weren't too many. I mean, Tom Meyer was in the industry. I really liked his stuff. Over
Yeah.
the years, talking about Bob Naismith, we actually got to work on a project with him through a different company years ago. I've never met him, but it was kind of fun. There's a lot of really good people out there. Everybody at Reaper, every sculptor I see influences me still, especially now because there's so much stuff you could do digitally that it's harder to do manually because you don't have a way to do right and left at the same time. And because of my eye problems, I have kind of spatial dyslexia. It's hard for me to match right and left. So a lot of my figures have asymmetric armor, asymmetric costumes. That's easier for me. If I ever get into digital sculpting, that'll be the one thing probably that changes the most.
So for me, a lot of names I don't remember anymore. That was back in the early 80s, late 70s. Tom Meyer, John Dennett are two on the top of my mind. I was lucky enough early on to be handed a shoebox of Tom Meyer's originals, and he just said,
Wow.
I won't talk to you right now, but here, look to your heart's content. So I got to go through all his early greens, and it was fascinating to see
Crazy.
what he could do, especially on things that hadn't come out, that you could almost see through the material. He was technically superb. John
Awesome.
Dennett's
Still
monsters
is.
were always cool.
Yeah.
Yes.
Still is. Yeah.
And
All right, Bobby. Are we giving you enough time?
Yes. I think I'm
All right.
prepared.
I know what he's
All right,
going to
ready?
Do you
say.
remember the question?
Yeah. What outside the industry? What is my favorite influence?
No, that's not it.
Um,
That's not it. Why?
when I was a kid,
Yeah.
stop it. I'm answering the question.
Yeah.
The people who really took my hand and helped me were Julie and Bob and Sandy Garrity, because I guess the reason I stumbled on the first question is related to this one. Is I don't have a lot of. I mean, I'm a nerd. I like nerdy type things. I like, I've liked Tolkien since I was a kid and that sort of stuff. But I like D&D. I like to play games. I like I like to play Warhammer. I like miniatures. So I'm a toy soldier guy. I'm much less of an art guy. I've always come at it from the side, from wanting to play with toy soldiers, and so my influences have mostly been in the industry. And when I first started to try to learn how to do this, the big three were Julie and Bob and Sandy Garrity, who really this was back in the early '90s, took me under their wings and said, "Here, dummy, here's a pointed implement and this is called green putty, and this is what we do." So it was really them.
Awesome.
You're to blame,
And Jason,
Julie.
we'd be remiss if we didn't include you in the question, Jason, too.
Oh, okay. Well, I did want to mention Sandy as an influence, but I also want to point out that in those early sculptor meetings that Glenn mentioned and Tom mentioned, those were mostly due to Sandy's impetus. She was the one that got the hotel rooms. Reaper often came up with a backing for just the facility. But that did allow us all to have a platform to meet each other. And I remember those days very, very happily. As far as industry influences, I used to have a game store, and I used to hang people's miniatures on the pegs. And I found myself coming back to Sandy's, Bobby's, Julie's, and Bob's very, very often. As far as Games Workshop sculptors, I think Kev Adams is probably one of my favorite all-time sculptors in terms of his characterizations. I do like Bob Ollie an awful lot. There's just a number, Jez Godwin. There's a number of sculptors that are just amazing, and even to this day, I'll haul out miniatures from the '90s and try to learn stuff that I overlooked or stuff that I've forgotten. And it's always a process. It's a continuous process. You can't ever stop looking at stuff.
If we're naming names, we got to say Mark Copplestone.
Got to say,
That's what I thought you were going to
there's
say.
so many. We got Mark Copplestone, definitely. There's just giants in the industry, here and not here. I mean, their help and their assistance has been invaluable through the years. I've never met any of the British sculptors other than Chaz Elliott, who actually gave me a pretty good shot when I worked at Wizards of the Coast. And sitting next to Chaz, I learned an awful lot about miniatures and an awful lot really about some of the ways the Europeans study art, even about the undersculpting and the sculpting all the muscles and the bones first and then laying the skin over it. All those things were invaluable. It was madness, but it sure helped. I mean, all those things helped. So, yeah, lots of different influences, lots of great sculptors, and they continue. I mean, the newer sculptors, I learn a lot from them as well. All right, so what's next? Michael's counting. We're supposed to count to 4 so we don't talk over each other.
Just 3.
But what happens then is we both stop talking, so that's no good.
I was going to let you go down your list with your next question, Jason.
Go down my list with my next question. Okay. Yeah. I've been kind of thinking about the process of becoming a sculptor, not just influences. And it's it's been my experience that most of the people in our hobby or profession, painting and sculpting, we tend to pay a lot of attention. We tend to see things, and I think um, I was wondering what tips people might have for being able to see things better to translate them either sculpting or painting. Bobby,
Get
you're
good
up.
glasses.
Get good glasses. Okay, great, fantastic. Julie and Bob.
See, yes.
You know,
Skip Bobby.
No, go ahead. You're having that issue.
I'm having problems with my eyes right now, so I'm not sure what to say about that.
Well, I guess
Um,
I'm not so concerned with the actual action of light entering your eye and your lenses and all that.
Good
Um,
thing.
Maybe I
I guess it was
misunderstood the
more an
question.
internalized concept of appreciating the detail of something or the balance of something. And is there a way that you've noticed that you can kind of train up from being a young sculptor, a new sculptor? Um, what is it that you notice about a figure
I'd say do
or a subject?
conversions. Take figures and say this would be perfect if it had 3 pouches and an eye patch, and put the 3 pouches and an eye patch on it, trying to match the style perhaps. It's a good way to get started, and instead of jumping in the deep end in the cold water, um, and then just work up to doing something completely on your own in little baby steps.
May I have a swing at the question again?
Sure, sure. I'm sorry
Okay,
you whiffed the first one, so I'll
Don't
come
get
back
strike
to
two,
you. It's
Bobby.
okay. Go ahead, Bobby.
All right. I'm not going to make a bifocals joke. I'm going to say I agree with Julie. And I made a joke earlier about making a career ripping, stealing ideas from people, but that's really the best way to start is you get somebody else's miniature and you say, oh, I like the way Julie Guthrie does shoes. Look at the little creases across the instep, and look how what tool is she using to delineate the sole from the and just see if I can reproduce the forms that she's created in my putty or now on my computer, and rip other people off.
Yeah, I'd like to actually emphasize that. That was one of the tips Bobby gave me when I first met him, was to go
What,
through
rip people off?
my tool bucket and and put each tool on the surface of a miniature that's already been sculpted to see what I could do and how it could match, and see which tool maybe made that impression or push that putty over to one side or whatever. The same theory applies digitally. As you know, in ZBrush, there's just a huge pile of tools, and it's always good, I think, to start out as an imitator, to build those skills. So, Tom Mason.
Yes. So for me, one of the most challenging things about seeing and sculpting in miniature was always getting the size right, the proportions. It's so easy to make something. For me, it would always be too large. I'm pretty good about symmetry and whatnot, but when I started to sculpt a figure and I didn't want the head to be gigantic, that was a real challenge. So for me, I always there's 2 things I did. If there was a figure that I could reference, I would always keep that nearby, and I would hold mine up next to it just to see how it stacked up against that. And then also, I always have a little millimeter ruler, and I'm constantly checking. I don't do it as much now because I've done it for so many years that you do build a muscle memory for it, and you know by looking at it if it's right or wrong. But especially in those early stages, it's very important, I think, to have the ruler and just keep checking, make sure you're on point with all the different parts.
That's a good point. Here's a simple trick. When you have your armature or dolly, as Glenn calls them, put a little ball of putty how high the shoulders are going to be, where the knees are, where the elbows are, and use those as references. And then when you're ready to sculpt that part, you just pop the little ball of putty off. and that might help
That's a
you
real
keep
good
the
point.
proportions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy to get lost when you're looking at just a wire or a very simple shape of the dolly. Yeah, helps to have that. It's a really good suggestion.
Yeah, you can lose those shoulder joints in a second.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to go right over the shoulders and forget that they move. Glenn, what do you got?
Yeah, I find that the longer I sculpt, it's like you start seeing things a little bit differently, how things are actually made up. It's kind of like you listen to music a little bit different once you learn how to play a musical instrument. You start looking at sculpting differently. Once you actually get experience with sculpt, you start looking at, all right, how do I break this down into its basic components? And it sounds silly sometimes, but if I'm having trouble sculpting something, sometimes I just got to stop and say, okay, am I overthinking this? What am I actually looking at? Okay, this is just a smush thing that looks like a piece of French bread with some notches in it. Okay, just make that. I find that kind of helps, and that helps too with not getting overwhelmed with what you're looking at. Like if you look at a completed sculpture, like, oh man, how am I going to do all this blah blah blah? Oh, this beautiful face. You got all this elaborate armor. How am I going to do all these scales? Whatever. If you just stop and say, okay, well, what are the scales made out of? Can I do that? And just do it like little pieces at a time. Like learning a piece of music. Sometimes you got to say, all right, what is the chord progression? Take it from there.
Good answer. Very good answer.
You should have started
All right.
with Glenn since you're so pleased with his answers.
Yeah. Glenn's,
Hey, I'm only
Glenn's been
good
kicking your ass.
because you guys make.
Yeah, he doesn't pass with a one-word answer, Bobby.
Maybe we should start giving scores.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe
we
you
should.
should get a little
Oh my
flag to
gosh.
hold up when you're ready to answer something, so that I know that you're ready for the words to come.
Well, to be fair, I'm
All
not
right.
as good as Bobby. So.
What you got, Michael?
Bobby 0.
Bobby 0. Wow, that's no good. I didn't know we were keeping score. I'm sorry. That's my co-host apparently. He's always a
No, there's
scorekeeper.
I didn't plan on it. All right, so from a painter's perspective, when you guys are sculpting these 3D little toys, basically is what they are, buying sculpting miniatures, when are you thinking about, and maybe you didn't start this way, but as time has progressed, are you thinking about how the various surfaces you're sculpting would be painted or how they're going to be interpreted? Are you taking into consideration? I think a lot of times when I look at miniatures, mainly outside of this group, but with other companies, I always look at the eyes and see how they're done. It's important to me because you got to be able to paint good eyes to have the miniature execute well. Are you taking into consideration how this is going to be painted up when you are doing the sculpture, if you're able to incorporate that? Does that make sense, Glenn?
Mm-hmm. Oh, am I started?
Yeah, that was my transition into you. It was a little, yeah.
Okay. All right. No, I got you.
I thought you could get it because I knew Bobby couldn't, so I thought that's why I went to you first.
Well, one thing that I did learn from Steve Buttle, who's I don't know where he's at these days, but back in
Games
the day, I used to
Workshop.
talk to him a lot about sculpting. Is he with Games Workshop?
Yeah, he's at
Good
Workshop.
for
He's a
him.
digital sculptor at Games Workshop now.
He said that one of the best things you can do when you're sculpting is periodically paint your sculpts. And I've tried to do that over the years just to get an idea from a painting perspective. Do I actually like painting what I've made? And you actually learn a lot from doing that.
Do you use more than one color?
I use whatever colors I got.
Okay.
Or Minwax.
I sure hope you're not using Minwax.
Oh, Minwax is a color, isn't it?
No,
That counts as one.
Yes.
Not a color.
Yes,
So
it
paint
is.
your sculpts. That's a good idea.
Yeah,
That's
that's a good idea. I wanted to add a little wrinkle as I pass the question down to Tom, because Tom, you've worked off of concept art from Izzy, but you do a lot of stuff on your own too. So when you are doing your own designs for your own Kickstarters or whatever, when a lot of times when we paint miniatures, we'll focus on an area, and that should be like the highlight area, the really focal point of the miniature. Are you considering that in your concepting up, and then when you're sculpting as well? This miniature, although it's going to be 3D and be around, are you really working to have that focal one shot, money shot image with the miniature, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I do try and take that into consideration, especially when I'm in charge of the design from the beginning, with the sketch, or even just from my mind. It's funny you mentioned the concept art part, because when I draw myself a lot, not myself, I draw for myself a lot, and I find my style has actually gravitated towards drawing things in a way where they would work in miniature more. Like I tend to have chunkier limbs and hands and things like that. So I think it's because I started to just sculpt more than I was drawing, and so when I would get back to that, I was always have it in my mind. I'm drawing this, but I want to sculpt it. So that would always play in my mind too. But to the first part of the question, when I was young, I didn't consider that at all. I saw sculptors I liked or things I wanted to sculpt, and I just sculpted what I wanted. A lot of times it was with higher detail, lots of texture, not a lot of consideration of whether or not it would be. What did you just put down there? How well
he's keeping score.
It would turn to paint.
Apparently, he's going to award some prize at the end of this. I don't know. I haven't been briefed on this part.
Oh,
getting a 10.
That was a 10.
One and
that
a
was
0.
a 10. Bobby,
that's a
take
10.
that and get ready. Yeah.
Wow.
But it's all right. I do take that into consideration.
Yeah.
So
I
art reinforces art, Tom, is what you're saying. I mean that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to Glenn's point, I think that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
I do too.
Go ahead.
I'd like to throw a question just out here. Valandar asked it in chat. Is structure or detail work more difficult for you? That's a very good question. So does someone want to start? If not, I'm going to call on somebody.
Just call on somebody. Keep it moving.
Bob Rodolfi.
You would pick me on this one. I don't know.
That's because you're good at both. So I want to know which one is.
I don't sculpt the whole thing. Detail's hard if you don't know what to put on a figure. I worked for a company years ago that just wanted detail for detail's sake, and they would tell you to put the stupidest things on there and the stupidest textures just to break it up. So that's not something I like to think about. Your turn.
Structure for casting is something that has to be thought about.
Ooh, that's a nuanced answer.
So I'll go with that.
Well, structure for casting. What tips can you give us on that structure for casting? I think it's a great answer.
Being aware of how things go in a mold. You don't want the rubber to creep under. You don't want something in two planes, arms going one way, legs going the other way, if you're going to have it for casting. If you're doing a piece for yourself, go for it. It's dynamic, but it will drive the mold makers crazy.
Especially if there's a difference between a rubber mold and a plastic cast mold, an injection mold.
Yeah, when you're dealing with steel, things get really tight.
Yeah. Well,
and that just comes with practice, I think, and looking at what's already out there and trying to figure out where the mold line goes. It's fascinating to look at bones and figure out where those mold lines are going.
Well, and on bones in particular, a lot of those have been cut up over in the factory that's producing them in a way totally different than we had anticipated. So you do have to know the process that you're sculpting for. And there's obviously different processes to be familiar with. That's a tremendous answer. See, that's a great answer. How about you, Bobby?
That's a 10.
Structure or detail?
Both.
More difficult, more important? What are you studying?
you got to have both. Like I like what Julie's saying. Well, I think the two questions are related. Michael's, you sculpt for painters, and structure and detail. They're really closely related. You have to, if you're making a commercial product, you got to sculpt for your audience. And if your audience, the consumer, is painters, then you have to take the needs of the painters into consideration. But you also, you know, my audience a lot of times is me and the way I imagine the figure being played with on the tabletop. So part of that structure is the silhouette of the figure. Does it look cool at arm's length? I think a lot less about, you know, because it's changing. Nowadays you see figures with really magnified giant images of highly detailed paint jobs on these figures that just a few years ago you never would have seen. And that's sculpting, because you know, now people are being trained to expect to see figures that close, whereas before, if it looked good at arm's length, it met the tabletop standard. But
Hey, Bobby.
no longer. Yes,
Bobby, as a follow-up to yours, maybe one for people learning to sculpt, newer sculptors, what would you suggest, or one or two, three things that you think about when you're thinking about, want to make sure that a painter gels with this piece? And so you're thinking about the painter. Is there a couple, three things that you can pick out that you think about when you're sculpting?
It depends on what you're, if you're doing it digitally or traditionally.
Okay.
Traditionally, it's easier because what you see is what you get. You know, what I'm holding in my hand is what essentially the painter is going to be seeing. But when I'm sculpting digitally, I'm looking at a highly magnified, distorted object that once it's printed, you got a different perspective. And so there's the temptations to screw things up are different for the different media. Digitally, the temptation is to use all these computer tricks that will wind up making a figure that looks plastic and flat and lifeless, or to just jam a bunch of detail on there because you can. And I'm in a good situation because I'm friends with a lot of you painters, and we have a good enough relationship that you can come to me and say, "You screwed this one all up. This is dumb. If you'd have done this, we'd have had an easier time painting it." And I go, "Oh, I see that." Like Rhonda decapitated me a year or two ago with this. I had been doing hair a certain way, and she just said, "This is horrible. Nobody likes
There's
your
the
hair."
bus. Just so you know,
Yeah,
there's the bus right there. Okay.
Yeah, she drove right over me. And so,
Right.
But it was really good because now I think the hair that I've been doing more recently is a lot better than the hair I was doing before Rhonda complained about it.
Yeah.
Well,
I agree.
Rhonda's in
I
chat,
agree with
isn't
Rhonda.
she?
Yeah.
Key lesson here is listen to Rhonda.
Rhonda,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah.
Is Bobby's hair better than it was 2 years ago when you decapitated him?
Yeah, she says this is not, yeah, it's not a remotely inaccurate quote.
Oh, well, there
But
you go. So I guess
I
you
will
built a
add,
house of cards, Jackson, and
From
now she just
watching-
collapsed it. So yeah,
from watching the sculptors go.
That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, from watching the sculptors go from traditional over to 3D, I have seen the progression of the initial 3D sculpts. Well, I'm sorry, digital.
Yeah.
Going from
Good
traditional
point,
to
Tom.
digital.
Throw my
How
pet
about
peeve,
that?
sorry.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks. Sorry, Tom. Tom gets a 0. But
Don't dock a point.
yeah. How many you taking off for that?
I have
Down to 9
noticed
now.
the initial sense of digitally, Tom, them being kind of more of a toyish feel, where the traditional green putty sculpts were more organic, in my opinion, and what I could see. But those lines have definitely blurred going forward. I mean, So it's neat to watch that progression of that and what you guys have been able to do digitally. But Jason, question
What?
floor is to you now. Yes, your turn.
Oh, the question goes to me now. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's talk for a minute. Someone had mentioned thickness of detail, so that we're getting down to some brass tacks here. But there's two different ways of looking at it. Either you're being a digital sculptor or a traditional sculptor. How do you approach the thickness of detail? How do you try to comprehend that in terms of how it's going to come out on the other side as a cast up piece for sale? I mean, obviously digitally, like Bobby was saying, there's a certain seduction with ZBrush and other sculpting programs in being able to reproduce something exactly the thickness it's supposed to be, but those details disappear. So are there any nice rules of thumb as far as thickness of detail, especially in layers? That's something I've always wondered.
May I go?
Sure. I'm glad you're warming up, by the way.
I know, right?
Well, that's a question I understand.
I think it's great. No, I'm happy. By the way, Tom, you can rate Michael all you want too. Go ahead, Bobby. Sorry.
I give Tom a 10. I just saying.
It's one of those. My experience has been you have to just do it. It took me about 30 figures of sculpting them and getting them printed and holding the print in my hand before I felt comfortable sculpting digitally. It was about 35 figures. And so it was just a lot of screwing it up. It's very difficult to if you're going to do figures that look like miniature figures are supposed to look according in Bobby Jackson's world, you with those 6 head high proportions, that sort of stuff, look like miniatures. And to caricature something you're seeing at such a magnification as you do on a computer screen, it's difficult to do it.
Bob and Julie, I'm interested in how you approach that. Say you get a nice piece of concept art and the figure's wearing a ruffled shirt with a vest and a jacket over it with belts and straps over that. How is there a way to look at it that you have figured out a certain way to do the depth of detail or the height of the detail?
Boy, for me, I think it's just experience. There's been a lot of times that, like Wayne Reynolds' art has 42 layers for a pocket.
Absolutely.
You have to
and 4 talismans stacked on top of each other.
So for me, it was just practice. The same with the thickness of weapons and spears, and you just got used to it. I had one person very, very early on, a man named Rich Smethurst, that was one of the owners of Ralpartha back in the early 80s when I first started trying to do this. And he sent me pieces of cut brass, pieces of aluminum, volumes and volumes of drawings of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I hadn't even started sculpting yet. He just said, look, you want to know how weird? Here, look at this stuff and learn. And then once Julie and I became friends, I would pick her brains all the time. But by and large, since I don't do any of it digitally, it's just practice and memory.
Also, I wanted to... If you're doing stuff from concept art, you have to learn to simplify.
Yes.
Especially
when
Justin,
you had something?
Yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a kind of a 5-minute warning here.
Okay.
Julie, you got the next 5 minutes.
To build on what Julie was talking about, one of the things I learned early on in green putty sculpting was that when you do layers of clothes, you don't need to do every layer of the clothes. Sometimes what you're doing is just the very edge of a layer and blending it back. And that helps your figure from getting too bulky looking. So
unless
we've
you're
got
Chaz
5
Elliott.
minutes. Yeah. Unless
Any
you're Chaz
questions
and
on
you put
chat?
every layer on. Sorry, Julie.
Are there any questions on chat that we need to?
Yeah, I have one. Valandar the Red, and as the question is, do you prefer sculpting from a description or a mood board, or basically someone saying, I want a X kind of figure, or for the freedom, or from actual concept art, you need to match exactly? Glenn.
I guess it depends on how good the concept art is, I suppose.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't mind either way. But if I have a good piece of concept art, yeah, I'd rather go with that. But sometimes the concept art is kind of, so you're like, yeah, is this really what you want? I guess, you know, customer's always right.
Right. Tom?
Do you put in any of your own input, Glenn?
Sometimes I'll mention things that, you know, maybe do you want to kind of modify this, or this will show up better, or many years ago I used to make molds. So sometimes I'll say, well, if you want this to be a single piece figure, this is going to cause you problems. Do you want to move this part? So.
How about you, Tom?
I've, especially in recent years, I've really grown to like to work off of mood boards and descriptions and be able to develop the idea in my own style a lot more rather than trying to follow a concept. I find that I tend to start to sculpt what I see exactly, which is sometimes desirable, but it ends up being a little frustrating for me because I want to maybe break out or have something look a different way, but then you get tied to that.
Before we get to a hard cutoff, because it's going to come quick, I want to be sure and thank everybody that has participated today. You guys are all my heroes, even Michael in some respects, to a certain. But it's been great. It's been great seeing you. It's been great talking to you, and I really hope that maybe this fall we can all get together in person.
That'd be great.
Yes. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Bobby, too. Glenn,
my pleasure,
Tom.
Michael.
Tom, it's just like we talked a few days
Thanks,
ago.
Michael.
It's
yeah,
eerie.
it feels like
just and then Bob and Julie, come on, the best. I love you guys. I miss you guys too. Thanks for joining us. This has been fun. This has been a lot of fun.
I will say before we do the old shuffle here into our new set of guests, I did get a request for Bobby here. Hold on.
Oh.
This is just for you, Bobby. Bobby, no, put the headset back on, Bobby. This is Bird with a Brush called in and paid for this. Okay.
She paid for that?
Yeah, she did. She was very adamant. She's
getting her money's worth. Look at that reaction.
Yeah.
That was great. What did she have to pay for that?
She just said please, and I was like, that's perfect payment.
Oh, that's
Who asked for that? Who asked for that?
Bird with a Brush.
Yeah, your hair sculptor, critiquer. Yeah, she said that your hair has gotten slightly better too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you very much, guys, for coming
Thanks,
out.
guys.
I have worked hard to please
Thank you.
her.
Great to see you all
do.
again.
Yeah, it's good to see you guys. Thanks for everything.
Absolutely.
Bye.
All right, we'll see you guys here in about 5-10 more minutes. Thank you very much.
Yeah. See you later, Bobby.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Yeah.